I'm Frank Vaughn, and I'd like to begin today with a couple examples of media bias. First up, this from City News out of Toronto. Premier Ford attends controversial Christmas party. Premier Ford spoke Sunday night at the Canada Christian College's Christmas celebration, a decision that caused some controversy.
I'm Maliha Sheikh here at the Canada Christian College's Christmas celebration, an event organized by a controversial Canadian figure, Charles McVety. He's also a conservative Christian leader who has extreme views when it comes to LGBTQ rights and the sex ed curriculum. He also happens to be good friends with Premier Doug Ford, who is speaking here tonight, a decision that's caused a lot of controversy.
Take note, folks, of the subconscious effect of the tightness of her lips, the barely disguised frown, the slight tilt of her head downwards. These are all subtle cues that you should be concerned. They also subliminally suggest to you that she herself is barely able to restrain her horror at Ford speaking at this event, but in the pursuit of journalistic integrity, she'll act out her part. But there's absolutely nothing impartial about the way that the media skews your perceptions of reality just by subtle intonation and selection of words. Now, I have a much better example of that coming up, but let's get to what makes Charles McVety so extreme.
The reason I love Premier Ford is because back to back we make a perfect circle.
A duo that's making the opposition and other critics feel a little uncomfortable.
Do you see that what she said there framed the clip that preceded it? Charles was making a joke about him and Doug Ford being fat. But if you're not paying attention, the City News narration would have you believing that what Charles was saying had to do with the ideological alignment between the two men. What exactly constitutes McVety's extreme views?
Due to McVety's views. So could you tell me a little bit about your views on the sex ed curriculum?
Well, I don't think it's appropriate to confuse children with gender fluidity. If a child goes to school to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic, not to put on other clothes and to be taught that they can change their gender. Gender is immutable. You can't change your gender.
The vast majority of Ontarians, and I would go further to say the vast majority of rational, reasonable people, do not hold with the view that a child's gender is fluid, that you should be having children engage in hormone therapy to suppress the natural evolution of their DNA into one boy or two girl. City News is pushing the narrative that this is an extreme view when it is actually the common sense view. Children cannot gamble, they cannot vote, they cannot serve in the military, they can't become police officers, they cannot become politicians, they cannot buy porn, they cannot drive. And that isn't the end of all the privileges they are denied because they are still growing into functional beings. A male bodybuilder entering into the later years of his life has more trouble getting testosterone supplementation than a child prepubescent does to repress the natural evolution of their DNA. There is a scientific basis for Charles McVety's view. There is a clear and common sense rational basis for Charles McVety's view. And there is a popular basis for Charles McVety's view. What the Wynne government wanted was the state to be able to intervene and deny you the right to raise your child as what it was born, that they would force you to pursue gender therapy. What Charles McVety opposes is a sex education curriculum that was crafted and overseen by a convicted pedophile by the name of Ben Levin. This was a man who not only sexualized his daughters, but wanted them to sexualize their kids as well, his granddaughters. Ben Levin did time for his crime. A slap on the wrist, as is typical in Canada for these sick pricks. A slap on the wrist for a man who was overseeing the education of millions of Ontario's children. And when released, he expressed no remorse for his sexual feelings towards children. If anything, he became more firmly convinced that it was proper and healthy for him to have these feelings. Just a reminder, this is Ben Levin in the picture, seated beside your prime minister, who has a lot of questionable associations with pedophiles and sex traffickers, which I've covered in other videos. And beside the prime minister is Kathleen Wynne, who was Ben Levin's boss. City News is aligning themselves with a curriculum that has been written by a pedophile, a man with a vested interest in sexualizing your children, a man with a belief in the right to sexualize your children. The opposition to the curriculum opposes a curriculum written by a pedophile. City News wants you to believe that is an extreme point of view, even though there is no scientific basis for the kind of radicalism they're trying to push on your family in order, I would say, to destroy your family. It is systematized child abuse. And the majority of Ontarians, the majority of Canadians, and again, the majority of rational thinking people, whether in private or in public, agree with me. Now, it would be irresponsible of me to pass on from this particular piece of media analysis without mentioning the media double standard when it comes to the horror of religiously minded people who challenge the sex ed curriculum, but yet they have nothing to say about things such as this. For those who don't know, this is a picture of that time Premier Wynne went pandering to an Islamic mosque. They made her wear a headscarf, and they seated her at the back of the room because their belief system is intentionally and thoroughly misogynistic. Now, before the people watching this label me some misallocation of the word racist or bigot, I am not saying here that all Muslims are misogynist. What I am saying is that this particular mosque openly practices and preaches misogyny. And Wynne went there and pandered to them. There was no City News coverage of the kinds of things that go on inside this building. There was no City News coverage of Wynne going there and being forced to sit in the back because she's just a lowly female. Do you think any Islamic mosque supports radical gender theory? I personally think you would be hard-pressed to find a single mosque that would back the idea of a little girl becoming a little boy or vice versa. Yet City News did no such reporting on this particular attendance. That, my friends, is a double standard, and it is precisely how the media works. Now, if you've noticed my glasses have changed tone, it's because I had to go outside and feed the kittens. But aside from that, the second media bias story is a little bit more subtle even than the first one, but I want to show it to you anyway because it leads into what I want to talk about next. Ottawa man facing charges after anti-migration protest Saturday on Parliament Hill. Right away, the headline deceives you. It was an Antifa member who got arrested. It was somebody at the counter-protest, and it was the left that was doing the violence.
Good evening. Protests turned violent on Parliament Hill today as tempers flared over Canada's migration policies.
Note, they're talking about the violence, but they are showing you the peaceful protesters that were on the far side of the fence.
Riot police separating both sides, 9 people arrested. The issue at hand, whether Canada should endorse the United Nations Migration Pact.
They did not tell you the proper name of the pact, the Global Compact on Migration. That is important because if you, as a concerned citizen, want to follow up and look up the Global Compact on Migration, CTV News has not given you the tools to do so.
CTV's Leah LaRocque was there and joins us with more details. Leah.
Well, Stefan, the protests centered around a global pact that would see more than 150 countries work together to deal with global migration.
Now, do you see what they did there? Work together. Who could be against working together? The intonation and the way the words are pronounced create a subtle and manipulative cue to you that if you're against this, you're against global cooperation. Note the selection of words again, and note the intonation, how she positively beams through subtle intonation that 150 countries are working together. It's how could you, the implication of the pronunciation is, how could you be against 150 countries working together? It's such a strong-sounding Unitarian inflection, and it's subtle, and it is manipulative. This, my friends, is what sorcery looks like in the modern day. This has always been how sorcery has been practiced. Manipulation of your mind, shaping of your will, control of how you formulate your thoughts.
About 400 people gathered on Parliament Hill today. Two sides deeply divided on whether Canada should sign the agreement.
Refugees are welcome, no hate, no fear.
A clash over migration.
So after spending the first 30 seconds framing how you should perceive the story on a subliminal level, they start out with a chant. Refugees are welcome here. No hate, no fear. Refugees are welcome here. They begin their coverage of the headline anti-migration protest with coverage of the counter-protest. They also, towards the end, show you who's committing the violence, which is Antifa, but they don't thus label it as they're showing it to you. Mentally, the whole situation, both sets of video, are framed by refugees are welcome here. No hate, no fear. Refugees are welcome here. The protest had almost nothing to do with refugees and had everything to do with signing the Global Compact on Migration, which is intended to become a legislative framework that the governments that sign on, including Canada, will use to implement national laws that weaken our borders and allow the United Nations to dictate that we take millions of people, migrants, from third world countries. Migrants who lack, whether you like it or not, the tools and skills to properly integrate with Western society, especially when we're bringing them in such large numbers. The issue at the protest wasn't so much one of immigration or migration as it was giving up our sovereignty to decide who and how we take people in to the United Nations, which is an unelected socialist bureaucracy. Have you ever seen CTV News or any other mainstream media outlet publish articles or do video series about how corrupt the United Nations is, the sex trade scandals the United Nations is caught up in, how little democratic input there actually is in the United Nations, how far left the UN agenda is, and how invasive their policies would be to national sovereignty? Will they ever tell you that story? Absolutely not. You're going to have to get it on your own from somewhere else.
Turning violent. One man facing charges after assaulting an RCMP officer.
I want to keep Canada Canadian.
Protesters on...
First off, they don't tell you the motivations of the one person who was arrested. There were also others. They don't tell you that they were affiliated with the left. And then after they show you that they're on the ground and they're being arrested, they cut to a shot of a woman who is clearly there as an anti-compact protester. And of course, at this stage, I don't need to tell you the subtle magic that they're working here. They cut to this woman after talking about violence, and the subtle implication is that she is part of the violence when she had nothing to do with the violence, that her cause was the source of the violence, which it wasn't. CTV doesn't have to lie to you directly. They're manipulating your mind on the subconscious level. And what about the soundbite that they pick to represent the initial representation of what the anti-compact protesters look like? We want to keep Canada Canadian. Now, I use that inflection because CTV wants you to look at this woman and see nothing but an illiterate hick. And I mean, no offense to this lady. I don't know who she is. But a person who gets a camera jammed in their face, who isn't used to that experience, isn't the most articulate. It triggers a form of motor distress. So you have the opportunity to get people in an unguarded state where they're not at their best, and articulate, so that you can craft a news story to suit your agenda. Believe it, folks. CTV has an agenda here. This is not impartial journalism.
Protesters on Parliament Hill, including Quebec's far-right nationalist group La Mouette, are angry over Canada's commitment to signing the United Nations Pact on Migration.
Notice how CTV is quick to tell you about the presence of a far-right nationalist group and how they label it a far-right nationalist group, but then the camera pans to the Antifa crowd and zooms in on them. So the actual subtle camera trick here is to make the protesters look smaller and make the counter-protesters look bigger. And I have to also note that CTV doesn't bother to tell you that Antifa are a bunch of raving far-left communists. Communism, which has killed hundreds of millions of people and enslaved even more all over the world, where wherever it's been tried, it leads to people eating dogs and starving to death, along with abysmal human rights, jailed political dissidents, one-party states, all the totalitarianism imaginable, but they don't bother to tell you that Antifa is a far-left communist group. There is no labeling of the left. There is only labeling and framing of the right so that you will dismiss them. Now, as always, I encourage everyone out there to watch this video clip themselves, read the article themselves, and make up their own mind. But I want to highlight again one more thing about the nature of this article. They never once tell you in writing or in the video the actual name of the document so that you can go and look for it yourself. So in addition to the mental sorcery they're deploying upon you, they're denying you the tools to counter that on your own. To sum up, what these protests were supposed to be about was the sacrifice of our sovereignty to an unelected socialist bureaucracy in the United Nations. Two final points I want to make before closing off this video, as we're already at the 15-minute mark. I always feel like I haven't said half of what I want to say by the time I get 3/4 of the way down a video, but I digress. I have come under criticism because I didn't make it to Ottawa, and Maxime Bernier has come under criticism because he didn't show up and speak. My reasoning for not making the 2.5-hour drive is far more personal. Has nothing to do with being afraid of what I would find there. I think it would have been interesting to cover. Sometime between 3:30 and 4:30 on Friday afternoon, as I was readying my camera equipment and charging up my batteries, I remembered that the next day was the 10th anniversary of the day my father died, not 3 feet from where I'm sitting. And unless the world hinges on my presence, December 8th will always be a day of solitude. Heck, there might be a couple days of solitude around December 8th, because I use it, much as some people use their New Year's Eve, to reflect on the meaning of things and life, which is a whole other subject. I've been working on an article all weekend about the meaning of things, and it's gonna end up being in its own category on the website under philosophy, because there's all sorts of philosophizing that I also want to do, but it's completely unrelated to politics. That's my reasoning. I will make apologies for it. Maxime Bernier, for one of many reasons, I can't even read this Twitter speak. It's got no spaces in it. It hurts my brain. But anyway, the gist of it all is that Max, get off the Max train because he didn't show up to speak to 200 people at this rally. First of all, nobody has fought the Global Compact on Migration as hard as Max. It's his official petition that's before Parliament, and it's his 33,000 members spread across the country who have really driven awareness and in the end have drove the Conservative Party of Canada to adopt a position. Even if you can't trust it, if it wasn't for Max, the CPC would have no position and this wouldn't have the media attention it does right now. Secondly, Maxime Bernier received threats against his person from both sides, far right, Stormfront, and far left, Antifa. Both claimed they were ready for a revolution. Antifa, at the very least, promised to crush his skull if he set foot on Parliament Hill. Now, Max would have had to walk completely unprotected from the Confederation building to Parliament because security perimeters were set up at Parliament. He would have been unprotected for the walk down the block. Now, I don't know if you know this, but he doesn't exactly have CSIS protection. Every time Max holds an event, every time he attends a rally, every time he goes in public, he does so at his own risk. His decision not to attend the rally had nothing to do with being a coward or betraying the cause. It had to do with common sense and reacting to threats that he was receiving in real time. And you are welcome to think that all I'm doing is carrying Max's water. Go ahead and think that, because there will come a time when I prove you wrong, and I guarantee you won't pay attention to that either. I will disagree with the PPC, and I will disagree with the leader, and I will do so with the same authenticity that I disagree with Scheer and I disagree with Trudeau, except there will be a lot less material there to work with. If you think Max not showing up on the Hill to speak, if you think that him preventing his association with groups like Stormfront, if you think him risking getting his skull smashed in on the way to the Hill by crazy far-left communists that CTV won't even tell you about is somehow cowardly, I don't know what to tell you. It's simple common sense. It's risk assessment. In order for Max to continue his work of sacrificing his career, sacrificing his reputation within the Conservative Party, giving up everything so that he can raise awareness about the sovereignty destroying issues that face our country, he must stay alive. That means that some risks aren't as important as other risks. And I'm sorry, the 200 people that were there, God bless you for being on the Hill and showing solidarity, showing that you're against this terrible compact for global migration. But the PPC has 33,000 members. They have more members in the Ottawa area than were on the Hill. These people are all united and working against these UN sovereignty-destroying agreements. Him missing one speech doesn't negate all the work that he's done to this point. And for the love of God, please, folks, can we start obeying basic grammar tactics on Twitter? There's nothing wrong with spaces. Generally, you can say everything you need to say just by thinking about it for a little while. You don't need to engage in Orwellian English to do it. Gods, I won't even read this. Most people won't even read this. They'll just scroll past it because they don't want to deal with it. I guarantee I'm going to lose a follower out of this, but I'm not as concerned with that as I am with the death of the English language. Let's not lose sight of the big picture here, people. Stop getting so obsessively stuck on symbols. All Mac's doing on the Hill, if he came there and spoke, is symbolic. And symbols might be important, but the big picture is far more important, which is the United Nations destroying national sovereignty and implementing a far-left, socialist, bureaucratic, technocratic, pipe dream agenda where from the top down they dictate how everybody lives and they dictate the national destruction of each nation within the West. Human Rights Council elects Kali Sek of Senegal as its president for 2019. This is in addition to Saudi Arabia, perennial human rights abuser, gaining influence over human rights policy and consequences at the United Nations. Because the United Nations is such a morally and intellectually bankrupt organization, it literally has no value as a moral institution. There is no credibility to any claim of morality or social justice or any of the other vaunted concepts and wording and verbiage that they use and promote. Senegal as its president in 2019. Senegal with female genital mutilation. Senegal with its urgent action needed on forced child begging. So that means that children are being sent out in the streets as basic slaves to beg for money. Leave no girl behind in Africa. It's not normal. Sexual exploitation, harassment, abuse in secondary schools in Senegal. So in their school system, systematized sexual abuse, and just so that we can keep our eyes on the ball, now we have a president of the Human Rights Council who comes from Senegal and represents the government of Senegal, who allows these abuses to continue in perpetuity. This is the big picture, people. Not Max speaking on the Hill, not some little protest, not even the Global Compact on Migration. The United Nations is an infection and plague upon the world. It destroys nation states. It promotes and props up dictatorial regimes with horrible human rights records in Africa, at the same time as it wants to take those people who are a product of that corruption, are a product of that criminal ideology, are a product of that violence and exploitation and misogyny and everything else, you name it. They want to bring them in and dump them in the West for their own national weakening agenda. That's the big picture, folks, and you better keep your eye on it or we're going to lose this, the final battle. To hang on to our national characters, to hang on to our borders, to hang on to our sovereignty, to hang on to the ability to actually have a say in our own nation's destiny before it is taken over by an unelected body that is the United Nations.